My other responsibility here today, my most important responsibility, is to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kurt Vogel, who I will now refer to by his given name of Spuds. Spuds is the Director of Space Architectures within the Office of the Administrator at NASA, and he served in this role since July of 2021. He joined the NASA community with over 32 years of U.S. government service, primarily in the Defense Department, as a technical leader, senior program manager, and as chief technologist. Prior to his NASA appointment, he served 6 years at DARPA, leading a broad range of innovative research activities spanning stealth technology, electronic warfare, air and space integration, and space control systems. Somebody's got to get their phone. There you go. And before that, there you go. Maybe they're telling me to get off the stage. And before that, Spuds led the research and development efforts at AFRL's System Technology Office, and also served as the acting chief technologist in the NRO's Survivability Assurance Office. Even before that, he served as an Air Force officer in both the air and space domains. He's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School, and maybe the most cool thing about him, he's flown 40 types of aircraft as a flight test engineer and a civilian pilot. He was also the chief technology officer for the Next Generation Bomber and led the production acceptance program for all B-2s that are presently in the U.S. inventory. Spuds earned his master's degree and PhD both in astronautical engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology and a BS in astronautical engineering from the United States Air Force Academy. I've been working with him closely since he joined NASA, and I can tell you there is no greater advocate for our capability to return to the moon than Spuds Vogel. Please join me in welcoming him here to the stage today. Spuds? Thank you.
Well, that was a very nice introduction. Thank you very much. I even got walk-up music, so thanks for that. Appreciate it. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this event. I remember when I first got here, Walt started talking to me about this LSIC and said, hey, we need to get you on these email lists. And sure enough, that's what 90% of my emails are now, is from LSIC. So I appreciate that. But now I finally get to an event and I see what it's all about. So this is an opportunity, though, for me, and I appreciate it. I asked Jim and Walt and Nikki, what do we think? How many folks in this community have seen the story of what we're doing with the Moon to Mars strategy and the objectives? And the answer was there's probably a lot of folks that maybe not have seen this. So it's an opportunity to kind of explain this pivot. As Bobby mentioned, I came here 2 summers ago. Pam Melroy, who I met when we were working at DARPA together, it was a couple days actually before her own swearing in as the deputy administrator, called me and said, hey, we'd like to get another set of eyes on what we're doing in our architectures, particularly on the Moon to Mars. And so, come on over and take a peek. Now, I've worked with NASA plenty over my career, but this is the first time, the last 2 years is the first I've actually been a NASA badged employee. So I had a little bit of freedom here because if y'all didn't like what I had to say, I'll just go back to DOD or retire again, something like that. So this is the result of some routine meetings with Pam and Bob and the Federated Board at NASA that has produced what I'm going to show you here. And what it is, it's a pivot. It's a pivot to a new kind of approach, a new methodology. And let me get right into it. First off, I will say that the artwork you're seeing here, this is the artwork for the actual strategy that went live on April 10th. It's got some Easter eggs in it when you start looking at some of the artwork in here. If you can identify what all the Easter eggs are, Bobby said he would pull some strings and get you a ride on Artemis 5. So we have to talk to Bobby about that. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong screen here. Yep, that's right. Okay, so the first step in this whole process is and systems engineering, it's a wonderful thing. We all know how this works, but it usually starts with the question, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? What problem are you trying to solve? And with Moon to Mars, we're not trying to solve a problem, but we are asking ourselves, why are we doing this? Why are we sending folks into space? And I would imagine of the 300 people here and the folks online and whatnot, for every person you ask that question, why are we doing this, you're going to get a different answer. You're going to get a slightly different answer from all those different folks. But largely, it's going to be captured by that Venn diagram. And it's going to be binned into probably those three pillars: science, national posture, and inspiration, or some combination thereof. What differentiates NASA from our competitors internationally, even our friends in industry, when they have their goals in mind, or they want to send humans into space, what's different with NASA is that we, as the caretakers of U.S. taxpayer dollars, we have to be responsible for that entire landscape. We can't just be hyper-focused on one area. So that value proposition forms a platform supported by those three pillars that is the beginning of the systems engineering process for us. And I know, sorry for some of the writing on there is kind of small, but just trying to capture the idea here. With that foundational pillar of why are we doing what we're doing, we then have leadership dictate the what. And that what has to have three key values to it. It's got to be rigorously developed such that we know it's reasonably achievable. It's got to be detailed enough so that you know how to judge success, and it has to not change. You can't keep changing with maybe administrations or whatnot. You can't keep having a new goal all the time. So leadership's going to hand over a detailed, rigorously developed what. We want you to do this, and this is down to this, enough level that you know what to do. Then the professionals take over from there with an optimal system engineering process, and they develop the how. You now determine the elements that flesh out the what, if you will. You have all the elements. It's usually run by a responsible organization. Most places it would be a program office. At NASA, that responsible organization is Jim Free's organization, ESDMD, the Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate. And you have to be funded sufficiently. That goes without saying. If you're not sufficiently funded, well, we'll talk about that in a second, because this is the way systems engineering should work. But the one thing I want to say, and this is for this crowd that's here, is that tank, and I'm sorry that the words may not be easily readable, but that tank on the side with all those various shapes, that is the stream of technology development that's happening behind the scenes. It's technology development that seed corn was planted years ago, and there's an evolution that happens from low TRL, low technology readiness level, all the way up to where it's ready to be transitioned and installed into that wireframe. So you need to have, that is, I think most people would argue that's the way systems engineering should work. However, we do run risks. Any organization will run risks with systems engineering, things that can break it down if you're not careful. The things on the left-hand side are the external things. You've got, as I mentioned before, if your goal is broad or changing, you're going to constantly be hopping from one foot to the next, and you're always going to start over again, and you're not going to get anywhere fast. You'll get there eventually, but you're going to keep restarting. External pressures. This is when folks are rolling in and they've got suggestions, they have demands, things that they want to see. Maybe they didn't have the technical rigor that was behind forming the plan to begin with, so that's going to create some problems for you. And then the insufficient funding. If you're not sufficiently funded, that program now becomes a level of effort. And if it's level of effort, that just means you're taking the budget that you do have and you're investing what you can, and you're kind of chipping away at the problem. You're probably still going to get there eventually, but if it's a competitive environment, you're probably not going to succeed on a pace that most people would deem successful in the big scheme of things. But those external things on the left-hand side, those things that we don't directly influence within the organization, those cause unhelpful cultural behaviors on the inside of an organization. And that's the things you see on the right-hand side that we're trying to avoid. So people get nervous if the goals keep changing, or they don't really understand what the goal is. They get fearful that their particular project or sub-piece, sub-element, system, subsystem, component, whatever it is, they get into their stovepipes. which I like to call cylinders of excellence. So they hide in their cylinder of excellence because they're afraid of being cut. They limit their communication. Whatever they do talk about, everything's perfect and rosy. And because there's not a consistent, oh, I just realized I repeated that there's a cut paste error there. The last blob on there, not poor, I guess communication, and it is very important, but that last blob on there actually should say distributed motivations, meaning that there is not a consistent story that everybody understands, so everybody tells their own story, where the thing that they're working on is the most important thing, can't do it without what I'm doing here, and they've got their own vision of how it fits into this very vague, broadly defined what. So this creates, and so of course, the people on the outside, when they start asking questions about what we're doing, and the people on the inside have all those elements on the right-hand side, unsatisfied with those answers, multiple answers, different answers, they then start to help. And as they help, that creates more tension on the inside, and then that just creates this vicious cycle. So we're trying to avoid that. We want to get out of this cycle. To get onto a better cycle, there's a little bit of context that's important here. For NASA and our partners and everyone who's been involved with this has been a 30-plus year roller coaster ride. I was a lieutenant in the Air Force in 1989 when President Bush 41 announced the Space Exploration Initiative. That was 34 years ago, right? And so that's a long time, and we've been on this roller coaster. And one of the big dips in that roller coaster ride was when Constellation got canceled. And so there's a lot of PTSD that everyone experienced from that, both inside the agency and our partners, because it wasn't just the rug getting pulled out from NASA, it was everybody who was playing with us as well. So that created a lot of stress. And at the time, the way of dealing with that, limited budget, and the program getting canceled, is we shifted into this capability-based framework, meaning we're going to build a rocket, we're going to build a spacecraft, we're going to have the ground system, and we'll just be ready to go wherever we're sent to go. So there wasn't really a mindset of like how this is all integrating, what the plan is. It was capabilities based, and that was as Pam likes to say, we're not throwing shade on that approach. We're just saying that it's not going to fully get us to from a strategic standpoint in a competitive environment. It's not going to get us where we want to go on a pace that we want to get there. So we need to shift. But there's one last element of this. Imagine we had that wireframe. So the how's been built out. That's the Moon to Mars plan. We've got that all built out. And we're going to inevitably, we're going to receive limited funding. Happens all the time. Happens in all the programs I've ever worked on or portfolios I've ever run. So what do? Well, you can do one of two things. You can take that limited funding and shrink wrap that wireframe around the limited funding you have. What you're effectively doing is changing your plan. You don't have the plan you had before. Now I've got a new plan. This is what I can afford. That's one thing you can do. I would recommend against it because that becomes your new baseline, your new plan, and it actually didn't have any of the rigor that went into building that wireframe on the left-hand side. Stick with your plan. Just prioritize and plan and be prepared for more fruitful days. Well, that, I believe, is what happened in the wake of Constellation being canceled when we were doing the capabilities-based approach. I was assured and told by folks that there was a plan. Interestingly enough, though, not everybody knew the plan. There were some folks at the top that knew about it, and there was either a real or perceived disincentive to communicate that plan. For a lot of reasons, it goes back to the fears on the previous chart. So what happened over time is that wireframe was not understood by folks, and all you were left with is this cloud pattern of the distributed things that were being funded. And that's, if you're in the vicinity of some of those blue elements on there, you can kind of see what the wireframe probably looked like. But what if you were in part of that wireframe, if you were working on one of those technologies that was off on the side somewhere, you were stuck to telling your own story. And that gets us right back to the whole, everybody had their own version of the story along the way. So what we need to do is get back to having a wireframe. And we need to be thinking strategically so that we can be flexible and resilient at the same time, because political resilience is very important here. We want to be resilient in 3 different ways: financially, technically, and politically. And we want to do this in a unified manner. So the way we're going to do that, it started with Pam then challenging the Federated Board, actually challenging the mission directorates through their representatives on the Federated Board with first She and Bob Cabana posited this is our strategy. This is the objective. If we're going to do an objective-based approach, this is the objective. This is the goal. If you're looking at a timeline, furthest on the right-hand side. So, and we call this the blueprint statement, or the blueprint bumper sticker. Create a blueprint for sustained human presence and exploration throughout the solar system. Now, if you just left it at that, I would submit to you, you're right back into one of those red blobs on the previous chart if it's too broad. Almost anything that anybody does can say, yeah, I'm doing that, right? So you got to come down a notch. That gets us to the next principle. The strategy, the methodology that we're following follows that robust systems engineering process and 5 interrelated methodology principles. The first is objective-based. That's that statement right there. The second principle is to architect from the right. Basically start from that objective and now start deconstructing from there. And at each level that you deconstruct, you keep asking yourself, what does it take to do that? What does it take to do that? To the next step. So when Pam and Bob challenged the mission directorates with, okay, I want you to take that bumper sticker and I want you to now determine what those top level goals and objectives are, the things as you just come left off of that, what are they? And they had proposed, I should say, we will probably have these objectives in those 4 buckets: science, infrastructure, trans and hab, and operations. Science, we're answering questions about ourselves and the universe. Infrastructure, critical support for getting this done over the long haul. Trans and hab, we got to get there, we got to get back, and we need to survive along the way. And then operations, we're going further, we're staying longer than we ever have in human history. Turns out the Federated Board agreed with Pam and Bob and said, yep, those are the right buckets. And then I'll tell the rest of the story in a moment, but basically there was a draft set of objectives we came up with last spring. You probably saw those. Those eventually grew to 63. I'll tell the rest of that story in a moment. But sticking with these principles here of architecting from the right, you continue to deconstruct, decompose each step along the way. Keep adding more qualifiers and requirements on there until finally you get the wireframe that we were talking about. You're going to finally get that wireframe. That's the plan. It's at that point, then you turn it into mosaic when you start assigning who's doing what, whether it's centers at NASA, industry partners, international partners. That's where the mosaic comes in. A lot of people see those objectives and goals and go, okay, where do I fit in? And the Viking feast begins. They start grabbing at the table and like, what part's mine? That has to be developed. You got to keep working left and get that all built out in that framework before you try and start to assign acquisition processes and whatnot. The third principle is, as I mentioned before, consistency of purpose. Once we have that plan in place, we want to be consistent, right? Stick with the plan. And there's a subtle but important difference between sticking with the plan and sticking to the plan. We're not saying stick to the plan because that would say we're not going to budge, we're not going to move. It means we'll change things as new technical insights come into mind, as you know, even maybe a value proposition shifts or whatnot. All we're saying is that if we make any changes to this, it'll endure the same rigor that developing the original plan endured. So we got the plan. We're going to make sure, and almost these could have been inverted. Developing the plan itself and then sticking with the plan needs to be unified. People both inside the agency, our partners outside the agency, the stakeholders across the river, everybody needs to understand and articulate the vision, goals, and objectives of what we're doing. Otherwise, we break into those red blobs and everyone's doing their own thing again. And the way that's all going to get tied together is through enhanced communication and engagement. That is the lifeblood for all of the rest of these principles. It's what's going to make it, it is what will make it work. As I mentioned before, the real or perceived disincentive to communicate the plan. Well, that's step one. We have to talk about it. And I don't mean talk about it after the fact. NASA is not bad at communication. I mean, we know how to showcase our successes very well. We're good at communicating, especially externally. What we're talking about doing here is we're talking about bringing people in to the creation of the plan and the modifications of the plan and the execution of the plan to make sure that people are looking under the hood and can see everything that we're doing along the way and participate in this effort. Communication is what allows us to raise public awareness, promote understanding, collaborate with our partners, and solicit feedback. And so along the lines of soliciting feedback, and by the way, I want to say from a communication standpoint, the LSIC, that community that I was introduced to of all those emails, that goes along, that approach you all take in talking with each other that I see all the time because my inbox is filled with this stuff, that's all good stuff. That's all part of this communication on the creation of the technology and creation of this wireframe of what's possible. So, but I did mention that part of the communication is getting feedback. And so last spring, I mentioned that we started with a set of 45 draft objectives, we being the federated board. Okay, well, we can't just do this in our own little cloistered environment. We got to get out and get feedback on this. And there's some folks that thought you're not really looking for feedback. You just want validation of what you did, because there's a track record of maybe different organizations doing that in the past. Nothing could be further from the truth. We set out on 4 different campaigns. 3 are shown here. One that's not shown here was internal to the federated board. We did a gap analysis to actually look at the draft objectives that we had through the lens of our current activities, and in kind of the inverse of that, look at our current activities through the lens of those draft objectives and see if there were any gaps, because there were inevitably going to be, and there were. But we also wanted to get feedback from our partners, from industry, from academia, from our international partners, and from the NASA workforce. So we set out on those 3 main campaigns, starting online, and then derived some workshops out of those, one for the international in London, one with U.S. industry and academia in Houston, and then an online campaign through NASA at Work, through the NASA workforce. In total, we got over 5,000 inputs. And again, this wasn't about, okay, great, thanks for the input. It was, we're doing something with this. And so we spent the last part of our summer last year just with SME help. I don't know who all, maybe there was folks that helped on the digestion of all of those inputs, but we did over a couple of months and made changes. We overhauled a lot of what we were doing with those objectives. We grew from 45 to 63. We completely re-indexed science, and we even made some modifications, some pretty good overhauls on the infrastructure as well. In total, like I said, we ended up with 63 top-level objectives spread across 10 top-level goals. The biggest changes, I would say, as I already mentioned, were in science and infrastructure. And then we introduced this new topic, or the new area. They weren't really objectives. We call them recurring tenets. These are common themes across multiple, in some case, all of our goals. We had those top 4 were things that we actually had plugged into our glossary. And we said, okay, these things rise to the level of going beyond just a glossary. The feedback we were getting from people, some of those other things, responsible use, interoperability, et cetera, was there were things that we fundamentally assumed, but the feedback we were getting is, no, you need to let's expressly state these as a grade card, something that we're going to grade ourselves against to make sure that we're doing these things across those objectives. You're going to see a bigger version of that QR code at the end of this brief, but if you haven't had a chance to see, if by now you haven't seen them, they were originally introduced by Pam in her speech in Paris at the IAC last year, and then on April 10th, we went out with a full document that describes in more detail the strategy that I just went through, the rationale behind these objectives, the objectives themselves, and then there's plenty of appendices that get into more details on the why and how we scrub the objectives. And there's even an Appendix C shows the mapping of the science decadals to the science objectives as well. So it's a pretty thorough document, I think, and it tells you the story of how we got there. So just to unpack a little bit as an example, especially we're talking to this crowd, this is page 1 of 2 of within the infrastructure section, the infrastructure objectives. So there's one overarching lunar infrastructure goal with 9 lunar infrastructure objectives. And just a couple things, I'll take you sort of through a guided tour. If you look at, first off, you'll see at the beginning of some of these, it says develop versus demonstrate. And for things that are saying develop, that means that these are the things that we need to fully reach full capability to meet our objectives. If it says demonstrate, it means it's an initial capability we want to demonstrate, and then there is a presumption or a hope that it will then expand into a more robust, be part of a more robust lunar economy. When you look at how we've binned these, I'd say 1, 2, and 3 are what Walt likes to call the utilities. Those are the, power, navigation. The next set gets into advanced capabilities, fundamental capabilities that we want to, that we think we're going to need for sustainability. And then the last bit are more industrial scale expansion or remote sensing. So this is just to give you an idea. These are available. This is one of those pages. If you go and scan that QR code, you're going to get to see in detail what these objectives look like. So what happens next is, again, we need to continue to deconstruct. So ESDMD is responsible for developing and do the rest of that deconstruction through all the way through to the end of the plan to get the architecture drafted up. And the way they're going to do that is an evolutionary process. They're going to build on an existing process that they were using called the strategic analysis cycle, but they're going to now switch and actually have that feed into this evolutionary architecture process that they call ACR, Architecture Concept Review. It's on an annual cadence. We just did the first one in January, but now they're going to shift it. They're compressing this next year to get it done in a October-November timeframe so that it ties in with the fiscal cycle every year. But we're going to continue to wash every year. We're going to meet, the senior leadership of NASA is going to meet on this once a year and then publish out what it looks like. And they're doing this in segments. I'm not going to steal Pam's thunder. She's going to talk about this tomorrow, about a little bit more detail about how this is structured. But it's a process, and I felt like we needed to remind ourselves internal at NASA, but we need to remind our partners outside as well. This is going to take time. If we rush this and say, okay, here it is, this is the whole answer, we're going to get right back in that old cycle again, and we don't want to do that. So it's going to come out in segments. ACR 22 is focused on the human lander return, and now this next year is going to start to open that aperture a little bit, looking at the Mars piece of it, as well as some of the science that we didn't quite cover in the ACR 22. So that's a cycle. Be looking for that. And I'm going to get off the stage now. I just want to, there's a slightly bigger version of the, oops, sorry about that. There we go. That's a slightly bigger version of the QR code. If you didn't get a chance, seriously, please take a quick scan of that. I don't know if these charts are going to be available to the folks that are online, but we can certainly get it to you. And with that, I believe, am I introducing Jim? Or, all right, Bobby's going to do it. All right, thank you very much. All right, and we'll do questions in the fireside chat, yes? All right, thanks very much, appreciate it.